Hello, we're continuing our study of Ethics Theme 1 for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies. Today we're looking specifically at Intuitionism. And last time we looked at naturalism, so we're continuing our study of the meta-ethical theory, so it might be worth watching or re-watching that last video on naturalism before we look at this one, because there'll be a lot of similar information and terms that are going to be used that it would be helpful to know in advance. So definitely re-watch that last video on naturalism. Okay, let's start by looking at the definition of good, or what is good according to Intuitionism. So the English philosopher G.E. Moore, who we'll recall for his several challenges against naturalism, so he proposed in his book called Principia Ethica that good was a simple notion that cannot be defined. He also thought that ethical knowledge was a priori, meaning prior to experience, just like mathematics or logic. Yet ethical truths don't need to be rationally demonstrated, as they are self-evident, existing independently of human beings. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of words there, and a lot of key concepts that Moore is explaining for what he thinks constitutes good. So the first thing is that good cannot be defined. So it's not made up of anything, it's not made up of a part, it is just good, and that the knowledge that we have of good is prior to experience, right? But we don't need to, so therefore, because we have it prior to experience, there's no need to demonstrate it using reason, because he thinks that good, and this is the key point here, is self-evident. So that means that it is just in and of itself good. There is no evidence that would be needed to back up the conclusion that something that's good is good. It just is good, and it's evidently so. Okay, and of course this exists outside of us. It's an independent fact that there are good things, right? But when it comes to how to recognize the good, this is where Moore is quite short. He doesn't give a lot of direction as to how we can actually recognize it. But he thinks that obviously there's no definition, good is simple, and our intuition is simple. And we'll look at what intuition is in a minute. So we have good is simple and defined, intuition is simple, and we don't need to do any working out, because remember that good or the ethical knowledge is a priori. We just instantly recognize it. So this is quite unique and quite revolutionary, really, in terms of ethics. It's the idea that we naturally, instantly recognize the good by our simple intuition, and the good is also self-evident and simple too. So let's look at this idea of intuition, because of course the whole theory is called Intuitionism, so it'd be helpful to know what we mean by intuition. Well, intuition is often referred to good as being sui generis, which means one of a kind or unique, because as we've seen, good cannot be defined, it cannot be put into other words. So it's different to other things, right? It is one of a kind. That's what we mean by sui generis. Now, according to intuitionists like Moore, all moral agents, which just means every human being, possesses this innate intuition, which is basically like a sixth sense, by which we recognize the good. So it follows that the good is not relative or subjective, but it has an objective reality, which is the same for all. So what does intuition mean? Well, intuition is the process of arriving at ethical knowledge, which is self-evident. So it's a conscious mental state that we all possess. So we've got the good, which is not identical to intuition. That's the first thing. Good is sort of there, okay? So there are certain actions or certain things that are good, and there is no definition of what that means. They just are good. And we instantly recognize them to be good because we have an intuition within us. So this intuition is what is inside us. So it's not the good that is inside us per se, but it's the intuition which recognizes the good which is outside of us. All right. So intuition is the process of arriving at ethical knowledge, or the process of apprehending a good. Okay. So it's a mental state in a way, but we can't scientifically demonstrate it. So it's not like a naturalistic theory. So our intuition accesses goods, as we've seen, right? So the intuition decides, okay, or it can sense in a way, okay, this is a good thing, this is not a good thing, this is bad, whatever. Okay, that's what intuition does for more. But it does not, for more, okay, just hold on for a minute that this is for G more, the intuition does not recognize what is the right action to take. So there's a difference between what is good, like as in a good, which we'll look at in a second as to certain things that are good, and the actual right action to take. Those two are two separate things. And for more, the intuition only recognizes the former, the idea of like just good. So it doesn't recognize the right actions, but the good. That's what intuition is. So remember that intuition is a process. There's a different intuition is inside of us. It's like a sense that recognizes things that are outside of us, which are goods. And another point as well that we need to bear in mind is that there is no justification needed for our belief in the good. So we don't. So if someone asks us, okay, how do you know this thing is good? We don't need to know. We don't need to have a justification for that. We just know that it's good because our senses tell us, right? It's well, not our senses and the five senses, but this other sense, which is called intuition. But how does Moore say we should act? Moore believes that when we ask the question, okay, how should we act, which is a normative ethical question, he believes that we ought to produce the greatest amount of good. So if any of you are aware of utilitarianism, this is going to ring a few bells, because the utilitarian says we should do the action which produces the most pleasure, the most happiness. Moore just uses the word good instead of happiness or pleasure, because remember, in when it comes to naturalism, he says that good and any natural property, such as pleasure or happiness, cannot be equated because good is much more than that, and it can't be reduced to such a natural property. But nonetheless, there is a similarity there with utilitarianism in that Moore argues that the action we ought to do is that which produces the greatest amount of good. So he says that it's our duty to, quote, do that which will cause more good to exist in the universe than any possible alternative. But how do we do this? Moore says that we must calculate which course of action produces the most good consequences. So this is like Bentham's hedonic calculus. So he gives, Bentham that is, gives a list of sort of criteria by which we ought to judge an action, right? Look at the extent of the happiness, the duration of it, etc., and see which action is going to produce the greatest amount overall of happiness. But with Moore, it's not so much about happiness, but rather about the most good and the consequences which have the most good within them. Now, in regards to the question of why there is disagreement in ethical debate, Moore argues that people who get morality wrong. Now, what does that mean? Well, because remember that we all have this innate intuition, and so theoretically we should always be having the same intuition. There shouldn't be any disagreement as to what the ethical thing is to do, right? If Moore is right that we all have an innate intuition, a sense to see what is good, then why is it the case that people disagree as to what is good, and that we don't always act in the same way? Well, Moore says that the reason that people have this disagreement, this debate, is because they make a starting error. So that the methodology is flawed from the get-go, right? So we all do have this innate intuition, but maybe some of us don't recognise it, or we suppress it, or we use something else to make our moral decisions, and so the intuition isn't the guide. But Moore is saying, actually, let's just let our intuition run free and let it decide the moral good, or to just, identify the moral good, I should say, as well, okay? Okay, let's look at intrinsic goods, because this will help us to understand more what Moore means when he says that the intuition recognises goods. Like, what are goods, or intrinsic goods? So, to identify intrinsic goods, that is what... So, in other words, what the intuition perceives, okay? Moore suggests that if we try to perceive of a thing existing alone, so in abstract, right, not with any situation, just a thing in its own, and it's still considered good, then it's an intrinsic good. That's because if you think about it, you could think of certain actions which in certain circumstances could be wrong and could be good. And so they wouldn't be intrinsic goods, they would be accidentally good, meaning sometimes they could be good, sometimes maybe not. But those which are always good, no matter what the circumstance, would be intrinsic goods. So he says that things like the purity of human friendship and aesthetic beauty are intrinsic goods. Since if we think of them in the abstract, if we think of them just in isolation, they are still good in and of themselves. And it's impossible then that there could ever be a situation or an example where the purity of human friendship is not good, or aesthetic beauty is not good, right? They're always good no matter what, so therefore they are intrinsic goods. So this is what the intuition for Moore is recognizing. The intuition is seeing, for example, in an act or in a person, it's seeing these values, it's seeing these intrinsic goods, such as aesthetic beauty, right? It's seeing these things and it's identifying them. That's what the intuition does for Moore. Now you might notice some similarities here between the goods and Aristotle's virtues. So Aristotle, who is an ancient Greek philosopher, had a lot of sort of abstract concepts that he called virtues, which are excellences of character, and he said that we ought to embody these. And in a similar way, Moore is arguing that there are certain abstract ideals that we ought to incarnate and enable to form part of our character, just like Aristotle says. And another similarity between Moore and Aristotle is that both were foundationalists, meaning they believed that knowledge has a foundation, it has to begin somewhere. And for Moore, the answer of this is in, or at least with moral knowledge, it's in intuition. So remember that a moral knowledge for the intuitionist and for Moore is gained through intuition, and it is a priori. So it's innate within us all, and there's no sort of it's not necessary for experience per se to like create it. It's already there, but experience can elicit it, if that makes sense. So it's already within us, but when we see an act, when we see a moral act, for example, the intuition recognizes, okay, that bit there is good, that's a good, that's not a good, right? So our intuitive knowledge of moral truths is infallible. And what that means is that when our intuition, because the intuition is innate and universal, when intuition notices outside of, this specific action, it will know whether or not that is good, and it can't be wrong, okay? Because the thing is that the good is, remember that Moore said that it's self-evident, right? There's no justification needed, it's self-evident, and so therefore the intuition instantly and unavoidably recognizes the good. But that doesn't mean that what we do with the knowledge, which is infallible, right? Because our intuition is infallible, that doesn't mean that what we do with it is infallible, okay? So our intuition or intuitive knowledge of good is infallible. It can't be wrong because the intuition instantly just is forced to accept that there is a good. What we then choose to do with that, so we've apprehended that there's a good, what we're going to do, that's then our free decision, and we can maybe act in accord with the good, as Moore says, to produce the most good consequences, or we can go against that. So that's Moore's theory in a nutshell. We're going to look in a minute now at some other intuitionists and their developments on Moore's theory, but we can see that Moore is giving a sort of objective and absolute and universal system of morality that is based on a sort of unverifiable, just sort of internal sense that we have. And it's also consequentialist because he's saying that we ought to do the action which produces the most good as well. So that's Moore's theory in a nutshell. But let's look now at H.A. Pritchard and what he taught about intuitionism. So H.A. Pritchard was another intuitionist who expanded upon Moore's theory, suggesting that it is the obligation to act, which he calls the duty, which is the basis for moral thinking, rather than simply the good. So remember that G.E. Moore argued that the intuition only recognises the good, it does not recognise how we ought to act, right? So only our knowledge of moral goods or truths is infallible, but not the duty of what we ought to do. But basically what Pritchard is doing is he's saying, okay, yeah, intuition recognises the good, but it also recognises our duty. So he's adding an additional layer to what Moore argued. So he did agree that ethical terms like good and right and wrong and evil, or good and bad, I should say, are indefinable, they're simple. But he also, again, is saying that rightness or oughtness, which is different from good and bad, right? They are like how to act, so there's more of a normative aspect there. How to act in a situation, our duty, is also accessible through intuition. So when we're faced with a moral dilemma, the intuition within us presents us not only with what is the good in that circumstance, but with the duty of how we ought to act in this specific situation, right? So Moore's going to say that if we're in a moral dilemma, all that our intuition can tell us is, okay, these are the goods, these are the intrinsic goods that are there. But Pritchard is saying, okay, yeah, it does that, but it also tells us what we should do. Okay, so there's an additional layer. So we just know by intuition what we ought to do. Okay? So, for example, Pritchard might argue that you're in a situation and you don't have much time to think about what you ought to do, and you do it. And sometimes you realize you made the wrong decision, but other times you just do it and you're like, oh, I just knew what to do, right? I didn't need to think about it. I just knew that what I was doing was the right thing to do. And that's basically him saying that there's an intuition within us which tells us what we ought to do, and we know it, right? We know what we ought to do just naturally, unjustifiably, just within us, okay? No rational process, no proof that can be given of our duties. We just know it because our intuition tells us what to do. He also distinguishes, though, between general reasoning and moral reasoning. So general reasoning is the common reason that we use. We look at empirical evidence and we form logical arguments. So this is what we use in all other spheres of life. But moral reasoning is just the application of intuition. So this is when we are in moral situations. So we could also compare general reasoning to being a posteriori because it's using, obviously, external evidence, empirical evidence, whereas applying the intuition, which is moral reasoning, is a priori. We just have the intuition already within us, and then in a situation, how we apply that is moral reasoning. Okay, so moral reasoning then is present in our unreflective consciousness, and is essential for moral situations. So we need to use moral reasoning when making moral decisions. Okay, and what this means, the unreflective consciousness, is the idea that we are, it's in our brains, it's in our mental states, but we don't need to think about it and reflect and sort of deduce things and make some moral equations and say, okay, is this going to be the best thing? Sort of like the hedonic calculus. No, it's unreflective. It just happens sort of in an instant, right? We instantly know what to do. We instantly are aware of our duty in a situation. Because Pritchard thinks that if we allow general thinking instead of moral thinking or moral reasoning to guide decisions, then what will happen is we will actually end up with a consequentialist theory. And Pritchard really wishes to avoid this, right? We'll see that More's theory was quite consequentialist. He says that we ought to do the action which produces the most good, right? But Pritchard wants to avoid this consequentialist because he, remember, introduces the concept of duty, which is a deontological idea. And so the idea is that if we use general thinking and we sort of have to think about the moral decision and we reflect and we're like, okay, is this going to be the right thing? We're doing all these steps. It gets too complicated. We just need to go with our moral reasoning, our intuition, and just do it, right? But once we've already made moral decisions, we can then reflect back on them, right, retrospectively, and look at them using general reasoning and reflect on our intuition, because it may be that we're not following our intuition perfectly. Our intuition may be telling us to do one thing, but we go another way. And that's also how he explains sort of moral disagreement. So remember that the Moore believed that people disagreed on moral things or moral facts and ideas because they made a starting error, so they had a flawed methodology. But for Pritchard, the answer as to why there's moral disagreement is that some people just have a more developed and mature intuition than others. Okay? So some people listen to their intuition more, and so therefore they have more developed intuition, and others are good at suppressing it and they just ignore it. Okay, that's why people disagree. But everyone still has the same intuition within them. So that's Pritchard. Now we're going to look at the third and final intuitionist, who was a man named W.D. Ross, and what he taught about intuitionism. Now, we'll recall that Moore argued that our goal of normative ethics is to pursue acts that create the greatest amount of good, but not all intuitionists agree with Moore on this point, and especially W.D. Ross. He argues in The Right and the Good that some actions are right or wrong regardless of consequences. So, under Moore's theory, effectively, any action could be justified if it led to the greatest amount of good being produced. So the means do justify the ends for Moore. But W.D. Ross thinks, hang on a minute, there are just some actions which can never be done, right? Even if it's going to produce the most amount of good. Okay, so this is a sort of idea that there are intrinsic evils. Similar to the idea within the debate, I should say, within the Roman Catholic Church concerning natural law. The proportionists, for example, we're just going off topic a little bit here, but the proportionists argue that there are no such things as intrinsic evils, and that sometimes it can be justified to break a precept if there is proportionate reason to justify that. Whereas the Catholic Church and Aquinas and the natural law would maintain that actually no, there are some actions which are right and wrong right or wrong, regardless of consequence, right? Intrinsic evils. And W.D. Ross similarly argues this. He says that it doesn't matter the consequence. There are some things which are just impermissible, or some things that are just always good. Okay. So Ross argues that intuition. So remember that we say Moore says intuition can establish goods. Pritchard says intuition can establish goods and duties, and Ross adds the additional idea of prima facie duties. Prima facie meaning like first impression, right? On the first sort of idea. It's it just comes upon you. There's no like reflection. It just appears to you, right? So intuition can establish these prima facie duties, things like fidelity and justice. And these should be prioritized over other duties when there's a conflict. So if we are in a situation where we're not exactly sure what to do, and it seems that our intuition or just like our moral reasoning isn't really giving us a clear duty, then we can look at these prima facie duties, which are absolute and universal, sort of like Aquinas' 5 primary precepts, and if there's conflict, prioritize these ones, because these prima facie duties are so, they take pride of place, right? They're at the top, like, again, Aquinas' 5 primary precepts, right? So these help resolve conflict in moral dilemmas. So again, he's going further than Moore, like Pritchard, because he believes that intuition can help us derive moral principles that will serve as general rules for behaviour. Okay, so he wants to, like Pritchard, give more guidance as to how normative ethics can be enacted. Okay, so he says actually intuition not only does it give us goods, but it also provides us with moral principles, these prima facie duties, which can be a sort of a basis, a guideline as to how we ought to behave. So we'll recall that Moore's theory was quite consequentialist, whereas W.D. Ross is, on the other hand, very deontological, because it has these duties, these rules, like in Aquinas' natural law and Kant's ethical theory, which make it more duty-based. Okay, and it's again, remember, he rejects the consequentialism of Moore, so it's more deontological in that respect as well. Okay, so that's Intuitionism. We're going to look now at the challenges to the theory. The first challenge is that there is no proof that moral intuition exists. J.L. Mackie believed that there are no objective moral values that can be known by all men. He gives the argument from queerness, which states that intuitionism is too strange and queer to be correct. So queer just means strange, odd, right? Moral properties apparently are queer because they are sui generis. Remember that's what Moore claimed. And that makes them implausible to exist, right? It's sort of something known in philosophy as ad hoc, where you just posit something that is quite odd and it's not really relevant, or it's not really in accord with what we already know. And so Mackie's thinking, well, hang on a minute, moral properties, according to Intuitionism, are very different. They're unique and they're on their own. So that makes them implausible. Okay, so he compares the claim that ethical knowledge cannot be verified empirically, which is what Moore maintains, with the notion that metaphysical entities exist beyond the physical universe. He thinks those things are absurd. It's like, okay, well, how am I going to verify that? Why should I believe that, right? And in the same sense, there is just no proof that these moral terms or even intuition exists. So therefore, we can just, from the get-go, reject Intuitionism. Where is the proof that there are such things as goods, prima facie duties, or the intuition? Right? The sixth sense. Where is the proof for that? So if we're going from an empirical perspective, or if we just want some evidence, like, where is the proof that we have this intuition? Well, do remember that Moore did argue that actually we don't need to rationally justify the good or our intuition. He says that it's just there. For some, that's unsatisfactory. They're like, okay, well, yes, you do. Why should I believe you? But maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is that there is no justification. It just is the way it is, and we've just got to accept it. Okay, and if we're asking for proof, or we're asking for empirical evidence or verifiability, we're just asking for something that can't be done. So that's one possible way of responding to this criticism. But there have also been, better explanations, according to some, that have been given for this idea of moral knowledge that we possess. So it could be our conscience, right, or the voice of God. Or it could be, if you're a motivist, or just our emotions, right, what we have preferences for in our emotions that isn't necessarily an objective sort of thing that exists universally in us all. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that intuitive truths can differ widely. So intuitionism, especially with More's version, basically fails when it comes to normative ethics, right? It doesn't give us an absolute set of duties or obligations that tell us how to act. Now, you might think, well, hang on a minute, what about Ross's prima facie duties and Pritchard's idea that intuition recognises the rightness of an act, like what we ought to do? Okay, and we'll look at that in a second. But some would still argue that at least with More's version, all we get is what the goods are, or that there is good. But we don't have like an absolute set of duties or obligations that direct exactly our actions. So it's vague, right? And we are left in the dark as to how to act in a moral way, which for some is the entire point of ethics, right? Like, okay, it's really great that you're telling me we've got this intuition and that there's goods, but what should I do? How do I act, right? And Moore doesn't really seem to answer that question satisfactorily, especially if he just says, just do whatever produces the most good. It's like, okay, what does that mean, right? It just sort of stops there. So again, Ross attempts to give a list of prima facie duties, but some would say that these aren't actually sufficient because they differ, right? First of all, how do we know what these prima facie duties are? They're supposed to be universal and absolute. Well, why do they differ from person to person and situation to situation? It seems that there aren't a clear set of prima facie duties as Ross would like to maintain. Or what is it when these prima facie duties conflict? Right? We'll look at fidelity and justice, were the two examples given earlier on. Well, what if we're in a situation where these two values are conflicting? Like, what do we do then, right? And even other intuitionist philosophers disagree on what duties actually are. So Moore rejects the concept that there are such things as duties. Pritchard thinks that it's the basis of moral thinking and that our intuition recognises it. And Ross argues that duties are not absolute. Okay, at least those that aren't prima facie duties. Or that they can be if they are in that sort of category of the higher duties, but that they need to be resolved if there's a conflict, right? So there's that disagreement here, and it sort of reflects that intuition or this idea of duty or just the whole theory is not real. It doesn't have real objective existence, or it's at least subjective, right? And there thus seems to be a lot of conflicting evidence to the proposition that our intuition is universal and that good is self-evident. Those two claims are really massive, and you need a lot of evidence really to convince someone that they're true, that there is a universal intuition and a self-evident good. And it seems that actually the lack of evidence and the idea that there are disagreements, even amongst philosophers of the same theory, as to what these terms mean and to how it's all going to be applied, that therefore it just isn't plausible enough, right? You could, however, respond and say, okay, maybe there is still a true intuition that we just aren't able to justify because that's the way it is, but it's just that we don't all apply it, right? Or, as Pritchard says, some of us have more developed intuitions than others, and we're all just at different levels and on a different journey, right? But others would argue that actually the disagreement, the ethical debate, which remember that Moore and Pritchard tried to respond to, actually it just points to the fact that there isn't an objective morality, okay? Because people disagree, that seems to suggest that there is a lack of objective morality. And people like emotivists are going to claim that this is best explained by the hypothesis that moral claims are just expressions of emotion, right? That makes sense. If moral claims are just emotion, then you'd expect people to disagree. And that's what happens, right? But if there is an objective morality, then maybe you'd expect people to agree more. Is that a valid claim? Well, you could argue that let's go with the case of science, for example. Science seems to be, at least most people can maintain, that it's objective. There are objective scientific truths, okay? But there is still disagreement on different scientific theories and different scientific facts. So there is scientific disagreement, but does that imply that there is a lack of objective science? No, it just implies that some people are wrong and others are right. So you could maintain the same with morality and argue, well, okay, people disagree, but there's still an objective morality, there's still an objective intuition and good. It's just that some are right, but some listen to the intuition, some recognise the good and some are wrong, or there's a varying degrees as to who understands it and who doesn't. Okay, so that's a possible retort to that challenge as well. And finally, we're going to look at this question of whether moral terms are intuitive. So that's been the central debate for Intuitionism. On the one hand, you could say that many people just instinctively feel that they know what is right and wrong, right? If you just ask your average person, why did you do that certain thing? Why did you act in that way? Or why is it that this specific action is good or this one is bad, right? Many, if not most people, are going to argue, well, they just know it. They just have an instinctive sort of natural feeling within them, okay? Whether that be, what right and wrong is or how to act in a certain situation. And this is exactly what Intuitionism argues, that we are endowed with an innate understanding of good and bad like a sixth sense. And also many religious people could accept this idea because we could, compare it to religious experience, revelations that we have, or conscience. And remember that Aquinas says we ought to follow our conscience, which you could compare to the intuition. And also, we'll recall that for naturalism, naturalism fell under the naturalistic fallacy, whereby it equates good with a natural property. But Intuitionism avoids this, and it ensures that actually good is a simple notion, that it doesn't define good because it recognises that the good can't be defined. But we could argue, on the other hand, that if moral terms were intuitive, we'd expect everyone to have the same morality and to agree, but that isn't the case. You could say that emotivism accounts for moral disagreement better. Psychology also shows that intuition differs from society to society, which would seem to imply that societal conditioning, not innate biology, is what determines our intuition or our moral beliefs. So naturalism could appeal more for many, because we can test it, empirically verify it, and it can be shared by all. Also, we don't know where the intuition comes from, or if there's any proof for it. We can't verify it, so we could say that actually it's unscientific and meaningless to say that there's intuition which we just don't know, we can't explain. But yeah, we could say that actually Pritchard, at least with Pritchard's version, we have a moral intuition which gives us a sense of obligation or duty when faced with a moral situation. So intuition is sui generis, and it's not subject to reason and empirical investigation. So when the naturalists or emotivists are claiming, well, we need to prove intuition, we need to prove that there is good, well, the intuitionists would say, actually, we can't do that. It's impossible. Good is just unique, and there's no way we can prove it. We all just naturally just know it to be there. We know by our intuition that there are certain goods, and we just have to accept that. It's hard to counter this because we all just know what to do, right? And many religions would even support this view that the world is an ordered place with laws and duties, right? Especially with Pritchard's version, where he has that there are certain duties that we are obliged to fulfill in certain actions. Religious ethical theories like divine command theory and natural law would also support this view as well. But then you could respond that actually, maybe the fact that, according to Intuitionism, moral terms are sui generis, and they are queer, they're odd, they're different, right? Makes them implausible. And the whole theory is just very odd, and it's unlike our typical mode of thinking. So we could say, okay, that makes Intuitionism as a whole quite implausible, and a more simple and common and verifiable theory would be something like emotivism or naturalism, or even like a religious one, like divine command theory, there's a God. That would be plausible that if there's a God, he wants us to live by his commands and to do as he pleases to fulfill his will. And so, but with Intuitionism, we just don't have that evidence, and it's very odd, and there's a host of problems associated with that. So, Intuitionism in summary is, while it's an interesting perspective, it's an interesting sort of objective form of morality that tries to ground it within ourselves, within another sense that we have, our intuition, that is universal and that there are goods. Some would say that there actually isn't enough evidence, or it just doesn't sound very plausible, or it's just nice and wishful thinking, but not real. It's not actually in accord with reality. That makes it implausible or untrue. But that is just a whistle-stop tour and a summary of intuition, or Intuitionism. And next time we'll look at emotivism.